Picture a highway that stretches for hundreds of kilometers, connecting Russia to the peninsula it stole a decade ago. Now picture that highway on fire, trucks reduced to blackened skeletons, fuel stations turned to ash, convoys forced to drive at night at reckless speeds just to survive the trip. That is not a scene from some future war. That is the R280 highway right now, and the weapon making it burn has a name borrowed from Celtic mythology. Ukraine calls it Morrigan, never before seen, absolutely lethal, and it is turning Russia's grip on Crimea into something that looks looser by the week. If you want to understand how Crimea, a territory that most analysts once wrote off as untouchable, is being strangled without a single Ukrainian soldier setting foot on it, stick around. This is Military Show, and this is the story of the drone that is rewriting the rules of this war. Before we get into the details, if you're new here, this is exactly the kind of deep dive we do every week. Real weapons, real strategy, no filler. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next, because this story is moving fast. Now, let's talk about the name. Morrigan in Celtic mythology is the goddess of war, fate, and change. That's not a coincidence. Ukraine is not just trying to hurt Russia in Crimea. It's trying to change the fate of a peninsula that Russia has ruled illegally since 2014, a piece of land that, until recently, most people assumed Ukraine would never be able to touch again. And now, a drone named after a goddess of transformation is doing exactly that from the skies above the Crimean land bridge. We first learned about Morrigan because Ukraine's 412th Nemesis Brigade decided to lift the curtain. The brigade published footage on social media showing the drone in action, and it did so deliberately. According to the brigade's own statement, they were revealing the platform with the permission of the manufacturer, and they called it their secret weapon at mid-range. That's a rare move. Ukraine typically keeps its most effective systems under wraps for as long as possible. The fact that the Nemesis Brigade went public tells you something. This drone has already done enough damage that the element of surprise mattered less than the message, and the message was aimed squarely at Moscow. So what actually is the Morrigan? Here's what we know. It's a fixed-wing aircraft roughly 4 to 5 feet long, somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 meters, depending on which source you trust. It has swept-back wings and a pair of tail fins for stability, and it's powered by a single propeller mounted on the nose. Unlike the quadcopter FPV drones that swarm the front line by the thousands, Morrigan doesn't need a runway. It launches from a rail or a slingshot-style platform, which means Ukrainian operators can fire it from almost anywhere. A tree line, a field, a patch of dirt behind a building, no exposed airstrip, no easy target for Russian counter-battery fire. That kind of operational flexibility is worth more than raw firepower in a war where every fixed position eventually gets found. As for range, different reports put Morrigan's operational depth anywhere from 20 kilometers out to as far as 300 kilometers behind enemy lines, placing it squarely in what Ukraine's military now calls the middle strike category. That's a deliberate classification. It fills the gap between short-range FPV drones that dominate the immediate front and the long-range strategic drones that hit deep into Russia itself. Middle strike weapons are built for exactly one job, making the enemy's rear area as dangerous as the front line. And that brings us to the target that made Morrigan famous, the R280, a highway Russia rebranded the Novorossiya Road, stretching more than 500 kilometers from Rostov-on-Don through the occupied cities of Mariupol and Melitopol, all the way down into Crimea. For years, this was Russia's safest logistics artery, sitting far enough from the front that convoys could move fuel, ammunition, and troops without much fear of Ukrainian fire. That safety is gone. The Nemesis Brigade's own footage shows Morrigan drones diving onto fuel trucks and military transports along that highway, filmed from the drone's own onboard camera as it locks onto a target and follows it in. Over and over, the same sequence plays out: approach, lock, impact, fire. The brigade didn't mince words, calling the Morrigan a game changer. Given what's happened to the R280 since, it's hard to disagree. It's worth pausing here to explain why a drone like this actually beats far more expensive alternatives, because the economics matter just as much as the explosions. Morrigan isn't flying alone. It's part of a growing family of Ukrainian-built systems, including drones nicknamed Hornet and Dart, that are financially outdueling the Russian defenses meant to stop them. A single manpad missile or a proximity-fused round for a heavy anti-aircraft gun can cost tens of thousands of dollars to fire at a target that, in Morrigan's case, might have cost a fraction of that to build and launch. Flip that same math around and look at anti-bridge strikes. Ukraine's behemoth drones used against crossings like Shanghar reportedly cost under $50,000 each. Compare that to a Storm Shadow or Scalp cruise missile, the kind of weapon Ukraine once needed just to seriously damage the Chandhar Bridge back in 2023, which runs roughly $2 million per shot. When a $50,000 drone can do meaningful damage to the same target a $2 million missile used to be required for, the entire cost calculus of this war shifts in Ukraine's favor. Russia simply cannot spend its way out of that math forever, not when it's trying to defend hundreds of kilometers of highway, dozens of bridges, and an entire peninsula all at once. The scale of independent verification behind these claims is also worth noting, because this isn't just Ukrainian propaganda taking credit for damage nobody can confirm. Open-source intelligence group Toshnie reported geolocating 55 confirmed strikes on Russian logistics vehicles in April, a number that jumped to 130 in May alone, with the daily pace still climbing. Separately, an analysis by the Kyiv Independent of footage released by Ukraine's first Azov Corps since mid-April confirmed more than 50 additional strikes, specifically along key logistics corridors, including the R280. These are strikes that outside analysts, sifting through raw video and satellite imagery, were able to independently verify, not just numbers pulled from a press release. But before we go any further, we want to thank the sponsor of today's video for supporting this channel and helping us keep bringing you this kind of in-depth analysis every week. Now back to Crimea. Here's where the story gets bigger than one drone. Morrigan didn't appear in a vacuum. It's the tip of a much larger Ukrainian program called the Logistics Lockdown, launched by Ukraine's Ministry of Defense in late May 2026, with a budget reportedly north of $100 million. Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov has described the goal in blunt terms: achieve what officials are calling a full logistics breakdown for Russian forces in the south. The idea is simple to explain and brutal to experience. If Russian units can't be resupplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, they stop being an effective fighting force, no matter how many soldiers or tanks they still have on paper. The numbers behind this campaign are staggering. As reported by Kyiv Post, Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander Robert Brovdy announced in mid-June that military cargo traffic along the R280 had collapsed by 71% in just 2 weeks. Read that again. Not a dent, not a disruption. A 71% collapse in the flow of supplies along what used to be Russia's safest road to Crimea. Analysts have started calling the R280 something else entirely now, the Highway of Death. According to the National Security Journal, that grim nickname has stuck because it fits. Burned out trucks, bombed gas stations, a road that Russian convoys now treat as a gauntlet rather than a supply line. Russia has tried to adapt. Convoys now move mostly at night, running at a minimum speed of 120 kilometers per hour in a desperate attempt to outrun drone operators tracking them from above. Electronic warfare systems have been deployed along the route to try to jam or spoof the drones. Neither measure has solved the problem. If anything, forcing convoys to drive that fast in the dark has created a new danger entirely separate from Ukrainian strikes: simple accidents. Push a fuel truck to 120 kilometers per hour on a battered wartime road at night, and drone strikes stop being the only thing that can turn it into a fireball. It gets worse for Russia from here because Morrigan and the broader Middle Strike campaign didn't stop at the highway. Ukrainian forces expanded the pressure to the physical crossings connecting Crimea to the rest of occupied territory. In early June, the Chandhar Bridge, a critical link across the Sivash, was heavily damaged by drone strikes, forcing Russian authorities to shut it down and reopen a decades-old pontoon bridge that hadn't been used in 3 years just to keep some traffic moving. Ukrainian strikes also hit multiple crossings over the North Crimean Canal and a bridge on the Perekop-Armyansk route, part of what OSINT analysts describe as an effort to establish what's called fire control over the region. The ability to strike these crossings repeatedly enough that Russia can never fully repair or rely on them again. Then came the fuel crisis, and this is where the human cost of the campaign becomes impossible to ignore, even for Russian state media. By late May, Crimea's Russian-installed authorities had already restricted civilian gasoline purchases to just 20 liters per person per week, distributed through a prepaid coupon system that sold out within minutes of release. As reported by ABC News, this is being described as the worst fuel crisis on the peninsula since Russia's illegal annexation in 2014. Long lines, rationing tickets, speculators reportedly selling gas at double the market price. Some hotels started offering fuel as a bonus just to keep bookings alive because, according to Russian business outlet Kommersant, nearly 80% of hotel reservations in Crimea were canceled in late May and early June alone. Crimea's multi-billion-dollar tourism industry, the one Moscow loves to parade as proof that life on the peninsula is normal, is quietly collapsing. By mid-June, according to United 24 media, the situation had escalated even further. Ukrainian strikes hit oil and gas infrastructure, ferries used to move fuel across the Kerch Strait, and logistics nodes across Crimea in a single overnight operation. Petrol sales to ordinary civilians were banned outright, with what little fuel remained reserved for emergency services and the military. At that point, according to reporting from United 24, the only consistently functioning link between Crimea and the Russian mainland left standing was the Kerch Bridge itself, the nearly $5 billion crossing that Russia built as a symbol of its permanent hold on the peninsula. It helps to remember why the Kerch Bridge carries so much symbolic weight in the first place. Russia opened it in 2018 as a physical statement that Crimea was permanently bound to the Russian mainland, a 19-kilometer crossing that was, at the time, the longest bridge in Europe. Ukraine has been chipping away at that statement for years. A truck bomb tore through the span in October 2022, killing several people and collapsing sections of the roadway. Ukraine struck it again in July 2023 and once more in June 2025 using underwater explosives aimed at the bridge's support structure. Each time, Russia rebuilt, patched, and insisted the crossing was secure. Each time, the message underneath the repair work was the same: nothing connecting Russia to Crimea is truly safe anymore. Since the 2023 strike, Russia has avoided sending rail shipments of fuel or ammunition across the bridge altogether, routing that cargo instead along the R280 corridor precisely because officials judged the bridge too fragile to risk with military cargo. That decision is exactly what has made the collapse of the R280 so devastating. Russia deliberately avoided its own bridge, and now the alternative route it built its whole southern supply chain around is the one burning. And that symbol has not been spared either. On June 21st, Ukrainian forces struck targets on both sides of the Crimean bridge in a coordinated overnight operation. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed the strikes personally, describing them as hitting maritime oil logistics in Russia's Krasnodar region alongside an oil depot in occupied Kerch. Fires broke out at an oil terminal in Kerch itself, sending smoke rising for kilometers, while explosions were also reported in Simferopol, Yevpatoria, and Sevastopol the same night. In the aftermath, Russian-installed authorities ordered gas stations across occupied Crimea to halt civilian fuel sales completely. Defense Minister Fedorov summed up what this means for Russia's war effort in a comment that cuts right to the strategic core of the campaign. Crimea has essentially turned into a military base for the Russians, he said, describing it as one of the most important targets Ukraine has from both a military and logistical perspective. Every truck that doesn't make it down the R280, every ferry that goes up in flames, every liter of fuel that never reaches a Russian unit chips away at the peninsula's ability to function as that staging ground. Ukraine's special operations forces have gone further still, publishing footage they say shows the destruction of one of the 3 railroad bridges connecting Crimea to the mainland alongside the Kerch Bridge and the Chonhar crossing. Russian officials, notably, have offered no confirmation and no denial. What we do know, as reported by independent outlet Meduza, is that a strike on a thermal power plant in Kerch triggered blackouts that left parts of Crimea running on scheduled power for only a few hours a day, with local authorities blaming vague technical faults rather than acknowledging the obvious cause. Crimean authorities have since loosened restrictions on how much fuel drivers can carry across the Kerch Bridge by car, raising the limit from 100 to 200 liters per vehicle, a small concession that speaks volumes about how dependent the peninsula has become on people literally hauling their own gasoline across the strait in the trunks of their cars. Even passenger rail hasn't been immune to the wider campaign. A Ukrainian drone attack struck a passenger train running from Moscow to Crimea, injuring the driver and killing his assistant, forcing a brief suspension of service. An earlier attack on a separate commuter train inside Crimea killed 1 person and injured 3 others, pushing authorities to shift schedules and limit service to daylight hours only. None of this is aimed at civilians directly, but when an entire rail and road network supporting a peninsula becomes this contested, ordinary transportation stops being routine. Tourists who once treated a trip to Crimea as a normal Black Sea holiday are now being told to bring their own fuel reserves and to check train schedules before booking because there's no guarantee either one will run as planned. Now, it's worth pausing here for balance because not every voice describes this as an unfolding catastrophe for Moscow. The Moscow Times has reported that nationally, fuel shortages in Russia remain manageable for now, with the government heavily subsidizing gasoline prices to keep inflation from spiraling, and with rationing incidents concentrated mostly in the regions closest to the fighting, Crimea chief among them. Russian gasoline production is estimated to be down roughly 10% compared to last year, a real but not yet catastrophic decline nationwide. So no, this isn't the single blow that ends the war, but concentrated in Crimea specifically, the picture looks very different, and even cautious analysts agree the trend line for the peninsula is getting worse each summer, not better. If you're finding this breakdown useful, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we're about to get into why this campaign matters far beyond one highway and one peninsula. Here's the bigger picture. Morrigan is just one piece of a much wider shift in how Ukraine fights this war. As reported by the Kyiv Independent, Ukraine's mid-range and long-range drone strikes have been hammering Russian air defense systems for months, destroying roughly 300 units in each of February and March, and another 250 in April alone. Every air defense battery that goes up in flames either has to be replaced, pulling resources from somewhere else on a long front line, or simply gets abandoned. Either outcome opens up safer flight corridors for Ukraine's drones, which is exactly why strikes on the R280 and the Crimean crossings have been able to intensify so dramatically in recent months. You can't hit deep into enemy territory if the enemy's air defenses are still standing in the way. Ukraine spent the better part of a year quietly clearing that path. Open source analysts have been tracking the scale of this campaign in granular detail. Ukraine's own General Staff and Ministry of Defense reported that throughout May alone, Ukrainian forces brought the entire R280 corridor under what they call fire control, systematically hitting logistics depots, command posts, and air defense assets not just near Crimea, but as far as 205 kilometers from the front line, near the Izvorian border checkpoint with Russia itself. According to the Kyiv Post, somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 Ukrainian drone operators and maintainers are now involved in this middle strike campaign, targeting supply lines that an estimated 250,000 to 300,000 Russian ground troops across Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and Crimea depend on to keep fighting. This is where the Institute for the Study of Wars analysis becomes so important. ISW has pointed out that Ukraine's mid-range strike campaign is grinding Russian offensive momentum down toward a near standstill along parts of the front, with Russian territorial gains shrinking closer to zero even as Moscow continues to throw manpower at the line. A weakened rear doesn't just slow an advance, it creates openings. Ukraine capitalized on exactly that kind of opening in Dnipropetrovsk in May, retaking roughly 400 square kilometers of territory in a counterattack made possible, at least in part, by a Russian logistics network that had been bled dry behind the lines. Retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, laid out what all of this adds up to in terms even a general audience can follow. Speaking about Crimea specifically, Hodges described a phased plan. First, isolate the peninsula by cutting the road to Jankoy and destroying the bridge connecting it to the mainland, then render it operationally useless for Russia altogether. It's a simple framework, but simple doesn't mean easy. And what's remarkable is how closely Ukraine's actual campaign now matches it, months after Hodges first described the theory. There's also a diplomatic angle worth mentioning here. As the crisis in Crimea deepened, Ukraine's permanent representative to the United Nations, Andriy Melnik, used the moment to call on the Security Council to push for an early ceasefire along the front line, framing it as a compromise Ukraine was prepared to make even as it tightened the noose around Crimea. He didn't mince words when addressing Russia directly, saying bluntly that Moscow will never be able to hold on to occupied territory permanently. Whether that diplomatic push goes anywhere is a separate question, but it shows that Ukraine is thinking about this campaign as more than a military operation. It's leverage, aimed at shaping whatever negotiations eventually happen. So where does this leave Crimea? Ukraine has been consistently clear that it has no intention of launching a ground invasion of the peninsula. That would be enormously costly, and frankly, it doesn't need to happen. Instead, the strategy is exactly what Hodges described. Isolate first, then make the territory functionally useless to Russia's war effort. Cut the roads, burn the trucks, threaten the bridges, starve the depots, turn a peninsula that Russia has spent over a decade fortifying into a liability instead of an asset. Roughly 800,000 Russian civilians live in Crimea today, and every one of them is now living through fuel rationing, canceled hotel bookings, blackouts, and the constant low hum of drone strikes somewhere on the horizon. That is not the picture of a secure, permanently annexed Russian region that Moscow has spent years trying to sell to its own population and the world. So what happens next? There are really three broad scenarios worth watching. The first is a slow, grinding continuation of exactly what's happening now. Russia patches bridges, raises fuel limits, reroutes convoys, and Ukraine keeps hitting each fix as soon as it appears, gradually shrinking the margin Russia has to operate with. That's the most likely path in the near term, and it's already the one playing out. The second scenario is escalation, where Ukraine decides the propaganda and logistics value of striking the Kerch bridge itself outweighs the risk, especially if Moscow ever gives in and starts running military rail traffic across it again out of sheer desperation. Ukrainian Navy spokesman Dmytro Pletenchuk has already suggested that scenario is plausible, arguing that mounting pressure could eventually force Russia to gamble with hazardous cargo on the bridge despite the risk. If that happens, expect Ukraine to be watching closely and expect the Kerch bridge to move from off-limits back onto the target list. The third scenario is the one Moscow is presumably hoping for, a ceasefire or negotiated settlement that freezes the current lines before the logistics lockdown campaign fully matures. Given Ukraine's UN diplomacy alongside its military pressure, that possibility can't be ruled out either, though nothing in recent weeks suggests Russia is ready to negotiate seriously while it still controls the peninsula. None of this happens overnight, and none of it is guaranteed to end with Crimea's full liberation on any specific timeline. Wars are messy, and Russia has repeatedly shown a willingness to adapt, however clumsily, when its supply lines come under pressure. Reopened pontoon bridges, raised fuel allowances on the Kerch crossing, nighttime convoy speed limits. These are all signs of an occupying power scrambling to patch a system it can no longer fully control, not a system that's collapsed entirely, but the trajectory is unmistakable. A road that used to be safe is now a graveyard for supply trucks. A bridge that Russia spent nearly $5 billion building as a monument to permanence is now firmly within range of Ukrainian strike drones, and everybody, including the people living in Crimea, knows it. And that's really the story of the Morrigan and of Ukraine's middle strike campaign more broadly. It's not one miracle weapon winning the war in a single strike. It's a methodical, layered strategy. Clear the air defenses, then hit the highways, then hit the bridges, then hit the ferries, then hit the fuel depots, and keep doing it faster than Russia can adapt. A goddess of war, fate, and change, flying quietly off a rail launcher somewhere in southern Ukraine, has become one small but symbolic part of a much larger campaign to change the fate of a peninsula that Russia once assumed it would hold forever. We'll be digging even deeper into how this isolation campaign is likely to evolve, including what happens if and when Ukraine decides the Kerch Bridge itself is worth striking again in another video, so keep an eye out for that. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening in southern Ukraine right now, do us a favor, hit subscribe, tap that notification bell, and drop a comment with what you want us to cover next. That's how this channel keeps growing, and it's how we keep bringing you this level of detail every single week. Thanks for watching Military Show, and we'll see you in the next one.